Welcome back to another edition of Literary Diss Tracks. Today we have William Burroughs, author of Naked Lunch, Junkie, and Queer, versus Truman Capote, author of In Cold Blood and Other Voices, Other Rooms. This one just has it all. Good old-fashioned jealousy, some class resentment, questions related to queer identity and literary exploitation, lots of drugs, magic curses, and some ACAB thrown in there too, just for good measure. William S. Burroughs was sort of like a spiritual father figure to the beatnik writers like Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac, which makes a lot of sense. Burroughs is a rather perfect encapsulation of the beatniks as he embodies their anti-conformity and libertine lifestyle. He was a relatively nomadic, queer writer who experimented heavily with drugs, but his writing also reflects this experimental subversion of traditional, perhaps bourgeois, literary forms, which is reflected in his masterpiece, Naked Lunch. William Burroughs, Truman Capote, was pretty much everything wrong with the literary establishment of the time. So at this point in American literary history, post-World War II, writers occupied a sort of celebrity that they just simply don't today, with authors such as Norman Mailer, Gore Vidal, and Truman Capote appearing frequently on television programs like The Dick Cavett Show. One reason why these authors garnered such celebrity was because of their huge and largely manicured or strategic public personas, which also saw them constantly beefing with each other very publicly. You can watch my previous diss tracks of Norman Mailer versus Gore Vidal, or Vidal versus Capote if you want some examples of that. And while there was some mutual and physical affection between these mainstream writers and the beatniks, for example, Gore Vidal and Jack Kerouac supposedly spent a night together, and Norman Mailer heaped a ton of praise upon William Burroughs, even taking credit for success. Burroughs and the rest of the beatniks nonetheless resented these mainstream writers, out of jealousy, yes, but also because they found their writing to be, for lack of a better word, boring, with Capote often being the lightning rod of their criticism. For instance, Jack Kerouac, in a 1952 letter to Allen Ginsberg, described Capote's writing as, quote, full of bull on every page. Capote would describe Kerouac's On the Road as, quote, it isn't writing at all, it's typing. In a 1952 letter to Allen Ginsberg, William Burroughs mocks Capote, while also mocking Capote's speech patterns and his maybe gossipy tendencies, writing, quote, my dear, I simply must read the short story about your affair with the Mongolian hair-lipped idiot in Dakar. It sounds too Truman Capote. A hunchback blowing you at the same time? Here's a good time to pause and note that while Burroughs himself was a queer writer, he abhorred Capote's inhabitants of his own queer identity, which Burroughs saw as overly effeminate, citing, quote, the distinction between us strong, manly, noble types and the leaping, jumping, window-dressing epithet. Not nice. William S. Burroughs' antipathy towards the Capote type of writer would grow stronger when Burroughs expatriated to Tangiers for a while, a place that was very suitable for Burroughs' experimentation with mind-altering hallucinogenics. But he's not the only writer who makes Tangiers a destination, including Paul Bowles, who is a central figure in the Tangier literary scene in the 1950s. In August 1954, Burroughs writes to Jack Kerouac in the States complaining that, quote, Bowles invites the dreariest queens in Tangiers to tea, but has never invited me. Since Tennessee Williams and Capote, etc., are friends of Bowles, I, of course, don't meet them when they come here. It also says, quote, I wanted to meet what there was here to meet, but they seem to have scented my being different and excluded me, just all squares instinctively do. And these people, Bowles, Tennessee Williams, Capote, are just as square as the St. Louis Country Club set I was raised with, and they sensed I was different and never accepted me as one of them. Now, Capote was probably aware of the bad-mouthing from Burroughs, because in a 1967 interview, Capote says, quote, I hate pop art to death. Now, William Burroughs, he's what I'd call a pop writer. He gets some very interesting effects on a page, but at the cost of total lack of communication with the reader, which is a pretty serious cost, I think. In a separate interview, Truman Capote is discussing his work in Cold Blood, which he says is, quote, really the most avant-garde form of writing existent today. Creative fiction writing has gone as far as it can experimentally. Of course, we have writers like William Burroughs, whose brand of Verbal surface trivia is amusing and occasionally fascinating, but there's no base for moving forward in that area. Responding to Capote, Burroughs initially says, quote, "I thought that Capote's earlier work showed extraordinary and very unusual talent, which I can't say for this In Cold Blood, which it seems to me could have been written by any staff editor on The New Yorker." That may sound like pretty measured criticism, but coming from a beatnik, that is devastating. It gets worse though. Following the publication of Capote's In Cold Blood, there was a lot of controversy surrounding the book. In particular, the question of Capote's closeness and exploitation of the murderers at the center of the book, and whether or not Capote may have intervened to save them from their death sentence, or perhaps whether he chose not to intervene to provide the book with a weighty narrative closure. After all, the method with which the killers were convicted and sentenced relied heavily on extracted confession. You can see this examined in the biopic starring Philip Seymour Hoffman, which is just incredible. Burroughs jumps into this controversy with an open letter to Truman Capote written in 1970, a letter that is truly bizarre, but very much a product of Burroughs. In the letter, Burroughs adopts a persona of a sort of writing god whose job it is to examine the life work of Capote and pronounce a judgment and subsequent sentence, a process that evidently involves interviewing Capote's various fictional characters. It's worth reading in its entirety, but here are some highlights. This is not a fan letter in the usual sense, unless you refer to ceiling fans in Panama. I have followed your literary development from its inception, conducting on behalf of the department I represent a series of inquiries as exhaustive as your own recent investigations in the Sunflower State. I have, in line of duty, read all of your published works. The early work was in some respects promising. I refer particularly to the short stories. You were granted an area for psychic development. It seemed for a while as if you would make good use of this grant. You chose instead to sell out a talent that is not yours to sell. You have placed your services at the disposal of interests who are turning America into a police state by the simple device of deliberately fostering the conditions that give rise to criminality and then demanding increased police powers and the retention of capital punishment to deal with the situation they have created. You have betrayed and sold out the talent that was granted you by this department. That talent is now officially withdrawn. Enjoy your dirty money. You will never have anything else. You will never write another sentence above the level of In Cold Blood. As a writer, you are finished. Over and out. Are you tracking me? Know who I am? You know me, Truman. You have known me for a long time. This is my last visit. Now, this curse that Burroughs pronounces upon Capote may be seen as metaphorical, but it's important to keep in mind that Burroughs did believe in such magical pronouncements, and Capote's career would never reach the same heights as it had with In Cold Blood. So, who do you got in this one? Burroughs or Capote?